At 7:12 p.m., my mother sent a text message that erased 67 years of history in less than 10 seconds. I remember the exact time because I stared at the screen for nearly a minute before I accepted that the words were real. My name is Patricia Morgan. I am 67 years old, and until that evening I believed that no matter how complicated family became, certain lines would never be crossed. I was wrong. The message was short. Brutally short. Do not call. Do not come over. We are done. That was it. No explanation. No warning. No conversation beforehand. Just 6 words that landed like a door slamming shut. I read them once. Then twice. Then a third time. Part of me expected another message to arrive immediately afterward. Maybe an apology. Maybe a clarification. Maybe a correction. Nothing came. The screen remained silent. For a long moment, I sat alone in my living room staring at the message while the evening news played quietly in the background. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the trees. Inside, something felt strangely calm. That surprised me. I should have been angry, hurt, confused. Instead, I felt tired. Tired in a way that only comes after carrying the same burden for years. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could have written a paragraph defending myself. I could have demanded answers. I could have reminded my mother of everything I had done for her over the past decade. Instead, I typed 2 words. Got it. Then I put my phone down. No drama. No argument. No attempt to change her mind. Looking back, that may have been the moment everything truly changed. My mother, Evelyn Morgan, was 86 years old. After my father passed away 12 years earlier, much of the responsibility for helping her slowly became mine. I drove her to doctor appointments. I handled insurance paperwork. I picked up prescriptions. When something broke in the house, I arranged repairs. When bills became confusing, I sorted them out. None of it felt extraordinary. She was my mother. Families help each other. At least that was how I saw it. My younger brother Brian saw things differently. Over the last 2 years, he had become increasingly involved in our mother's life. At first, I welcomed the help. It seemed fair. For too long, most responsibilities had fallen on my shoulders. But little things began changing. Conversations I used to be included in suddenly happened without me. Decisions were made before I heard about them. Information stopped flowing the way it once had. Whenever I asked questions, Brian always had an explanation ready. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make me doubt my instincts. My mother changed too. Not all at once. Gradually. Some days she sounded warm and familiar. Other days she seemed distant. Irritated. Suspicious even. More than once she accused me of forgetting things that never happened. More than once she repeated stories that sounded strangely similar to things Brian had said. I noticed the pattern but never pushed too hard. She was getting older. Families go through difficult seasons. That was what I kept telling myself. The truth is that I ignored a lot because I wanted peace. I wanted to believe the family I spent my life protecting still existed. The text message forced me to confront a possibility I had been avoiding. Maybe the distance was not accidental. Maybe someone wanted it. At 7:13 p.m., I put my phone face down on the coffee table and walked into the kitchen. I made a cup of tea. I washed a few dishes. I fed the cat. Ordinary things. The kind of things people do when they are trying not to think. Yet one question refused to leave my mind. Why now? Why after all these years? I did not know it then, but before midnight arrived, I was going to receive an answer that would change the way I viewed my family forever. For the first time in more than a decade, I stopped. I did not call my mother the next morning. I did not check whether she had taken her medication. I did not review upcoming appointments. I did not open the folder on my laptop that contained her insurance information, utility account numbers, and emergency contacts. I simply left everything exactly where it was and went about my day. The strange part was how unnatural that felt. Over the years, helping my mother had become woven into my routine so completely that I often performed tasks without thinking about them. Every Tuesday, I confirmed her prescription refills. Every Thursday, I checked her calendar for upcoming appointments. Every Sunday evening I called to make sure she had groceries for the week. Those habits had become part of my life. Now, because of 6 words in a text message, all of it stopped. Around 10 o'clock that morning I found myself reaching for my phone out of instinct. Then I remembered. Do not call. Do not come over. We are done. Those words had not been vague. They had been clear. So I respected them. By lunchtime I began noticing something else. My phone remained unusually quiet. Normally there would have been at least one message from my mother asking where a document was stored or how to reset a password. Sometimes she forgot appointment times. Sometimes she misplaced information. Those calls never came. At first I assumed Brian had stepped in to handle everything. After all, he had spent the last 2 years positioning himself as the helpful son. Maybe this was what he wanted. Maybe this was what both of them wanted. As the afternoon passed, memories kept surfacing. Not dramatic memories. Small ones. The kind people overlook until they disappear. I remembered sitting in waiting rooms during medical appointments. I remembered spending entire Saturdays organizing paperwork. I remembered driving 40 minutes across town because a television remote stopped working and my mother refused to wait until the next day. None of those moments bothered me when they happened. They were acts of care. But looking back, I realized something uncomfortable. Very few people seem to notice them, including my mother. Caregiving often becomes invisible when it is done consistently. People stop seeing the effort because they become accustomed to the result. By early evening, I found myself wondering whether my absence had even been noticed. Then I laughed at the thought. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had been completely removed from my mother's life. Why would anyone notice the work that disappeared with me? That question stayed with me as I prepared dinner. Later that night, I sat in my living room with a book open on my lap. I was not actually reading. My attention kept drifting. I thought about Brian. In recent years, he had become the gatekeeper of information. Whenever I called my mother, he somehow already knew about the conversation. Whenever plans changed, he was involved. Whenever misunderstandings occurred, he seemed unusually prepared to explain them. At the time, I dismissed those observations. Families are complicated. People become involved for different reasons. But now, sitting alone in the quiet house, those details felt different. They felt connected. At 10:47 p.m., my phone lit up with an incoming message. My heart jumped before I even looked at the screen. It was not from my mother. It was not from Brian. It was from someone I had not heard from in months. I stared at the name for several seconds. The message itself was short. Patricia, I think there is something you need to know about what has been happening. Suddenly, I was no longer thinking about the text my mother had sent. I was thinking about why she had sent it. And for the first time, I suspected the answer might be far bigger than a family argument. My hands were shaking slightly when I opened the message. The sender was my niece Sarah, Brian's daughter. We had always gotten along, but over the past year our conversations had become less frequent. At first I assumed life had simply become busy. Now I was no longer so sure. I typed a short reply asking what she meant. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally her response arrived. Can I call you? I looked at the clock. It was 10:58 p.m. Under normal circumstances, I would have suggested waiting until morning. Nothing about this situation felt normal. I told her to call. The phone rang within seconds. Sarah sounded nervous. Not frightened. Nervous. Like someone carrying information they were not sure how to share. For the first minute we exchanged small talk neither of us cared about. Then she took a deep breath. Aunt Patricia, I do not think Grandma sent that text by herself. I sat up straighter in my chair. What do you mean? There was a pause. I have seen Uncle Brian helping her with her phone a lot lately. More than helping. Sometimes he answers messages for her. Sometimes he tells her what to write. I remained silent. Sarah continued. I did not think much about it at first. But over the past few months things started feeling strange. Grandma would say things about you that did not sound like her. My stomach tightened. What kinds of things? Another pause. That you never visited. That you did not help. That you only called when you needed something. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Those accusations were the exact opposite of reality. Sarah seemed to sense my reaction. I know they are not true, she said quickly. That is why I am calling. For the next 20 minutes, she described conversations she had overheard. Nothing dramatic. No shocking confession. Just a collection of small details. Comments. Suggestions. Corrections. Brian frequently explained situations to Evelyn before anyone else could. Brian often interpreted Patricia's actions for Evelyn. Brian seemed to control what information reached her and how it was presented. Individually, none of the stories proved anything. Together, they painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. When the call finally ended, it was 11:32 p.m. I set my phone down and stared across the room. Suddenly, dozens of confusing moments from the past 2 years began fitting together. The forgotten invitations. The unusual misunderstandings. The accusations that appeared from nowhere. The growing distance between my mother and me. I had spent months assuming age was responsible. Maybe it was not age. Maybe someone had been carefully shaping the narrative all along. At 11:43 p.m. my phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed a number I recognized immediately. It belonged to my mother's neighbor, a retired teacher named Linda who had lived next door to her for nearly 15 years. I answered at once. Linda sounded concerned. She explained that my mother had become upset earlier that evening. Apparently, she was looking for information related to an upcoming medical appointment. Normally, she would have called me. Then Linda stopped speaking. Patricia, she said carefully, your mother seemed genuinely confused when I asked why she was not calling you. I felt my heart skip a beat. What did she say? Linda hesitated. She said you stopped caring about her months ago. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Sarah's words echoed in my mind. Someone was lying. And for the first time, I was beginning to suspect my mother had been hearing that lie for a very long time. I barely slept that night. After speaking with Sarah and Linda, my mind refused to slow down. Every conversation from the past 2 years seemed to replay itself in a different light. Situations that once appeared random now looked connected. Misunderstandings that I blamed on age suddenly felt manufactured. By morning, I was no longer asking whether something was wrong. I was asking how long it had been happening. Around 8 o'clock, I walked into my home office and opened a file cabinet containing years of documents related to my mother's care. Medical schedules, insurance records, repair invoices, prescription histories, emergency contacts. The collection filled several folders. Looking at them felt surreal. According to the story my mother apparently believed, I had abandoned her months ago. Yet the paperwork in front of me told a completely different story. I spent the next several hours reviewing dates. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Nearly every major responsibility connected to my mother's life still carried my fingerprints. I had arranged appointments, paid invoices when systems malfunctioned, coordinated transportation, solved problems nobody else even knew existed. The more evidence I reviewed, the more confused I became. How could my mother genuinely believe I no longer cared? Shortly after noon, another clue appeared. While searching through old email chains, I discovered several messages I had sent directly to my mother over the previous year. Messages that had never received replies. At first I assumed she simply forgot to respond. Then I noticed something unusual. Many of those messages contained information she later claimed she never received. Appointment reminders, family updates, important details. Entire conversations seemed to have vanished somewhere between my inbox and her understanding of reality. That realization sent a chill through me. Around 2 o'clock my phone rang. It was Sarah again. This time she sounded less nervous and more determined. She explained that after our conversation the previous night, she began thinking about things she had witnessed herself. One memory stood out. Several months earlier, she had watched Brian delete notifications from Evelyn's phone while explaining that certain messages would only upset her. Sarah did not think much about it at the time. Now she viewed it differently. So did I. The possibility that information had been filtered before reaching my mother changed everything. It meant the conflict might not have started where I thought it did. It meant someone could have been controlling what she saw and what she believed. That evening I took a long walk through my neighborhood. The air felt cool and crisp. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets. Neighbors watered gardens. Ordinary life continued all around me. Yet inside my head, years of assumptions were collapsing. I kept returning to one question. Why? Why would anyone work so hard to create distance between a mother and daughter? The answer never arrived. Not yet. But another realization did. For years, I had been reacting to symptoms instead of examining causes. Every misunderstanding became a separate problem. Every argument became an isolated event. I never stepped back far enough to see the entire picture. Now the picture was beginning to emerge. By early evening, I made a decision. I would not contact my mother despite every instinct telling me to do so. If someone had spent years shaping the story she believed, one emotional phone call would not fix it. Facts would matter more than feelings. Evidence would matter more than assumptions. Later that night, as I organized documents across my dining room table, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unfamiliar number. The sender identified herself as an employee from a medical office I had coordinated with many times before. The message contained only one sentence. Patricia, I thought you should know your brother recently requested that all appointment updates be sent exclusively to him. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I slowly set the phone down. The truth was no longer hiding in shadows. Piece by piece, it was beginning to reveal itself. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. For days, I had been chasing clues. Now the clues were beginning to point in the same direction. That did not mean I had all the answers. It simply meant I could no longer pretend the situation was a series of unrelated misunderstandings. Something deliberate had been happening. The question was how far it went. After breakfast, I continued reviewing records and correspondence. The deeper I looked, the more obvious certain patterns became. Over the previous 18 months, information had slowly stopped flowing through the channels that once connected my mother and me. Appointment notifications were redirected. Updates arrived late or not at all. Conversations were interrupted by explanations I never requested. Piece by piece, my role in my mother's life had been quietly reduced. Not publicly, not dramatically, gradually, almost invisibly. Around noon, Sarah called again. This time she sounded frustrated. She told me she had spoken with her father the previous evening. Apparently, he was angry that several people had started asking questions. According to Sarah, Brian insisted he was only protecting Evelyn from stress. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Protecting someone from stress does not require isolating them from family. Protecting someone from stress does not require controlling information. Protecting someone from stress certainly does not require convincing them that their daughter no longer cares. After ending the call, I found myself thinking about my mother rather than my brother. Evelyn had always been strong-willed. Even at 86, she disliked depending on other people. That independence was one of the reasons I never believed she would willingly cut me out without a significant reason. The text message still bothered me. Not because it was hurtful, because it felt wrong. The wording sounded unnatural, cold, mechanical, almost unlike her. The more I replayed it in my head, the more convinced I became that something about it did not fit. Later that afternoon, another unexpected call arrived. This time it came from a pharmacist who had known our family for years. He was updating contact information and noticed something unusual in the records. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that Brian had recently requested changes to emergency notification preferences. My name had been removed from several contact lists. Hearing that made me close my eyes for a moment. The pattern was now impossible to deny. Someone had not merely influenced my mother's opinion. Someone had been systematically removing me from her support network. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. A week earlier, I might have reacted emotionally. Now I felt something different. Determination. Every new piece of information strengthened rather than weakened me. Facts have a unique power. They eliminate confusion. They replace suspicion with certainty. That evening I sat on my back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. For the first time since receiving that text, I stopped asking whether my mother wanted me gone. Instead, I started asking what would happen now that I was gone. For years, I handled dozens of responsibilities nobody noticed. Appointments occurred because I scheduled them. Problems were solved because I solved them. Bills were paid on time because I monitored them. If Brian truly wanted complete control, he was about to discover exactly how much invisible work came with that control. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a message from Linda. She had checked on Evelyn earlier in the day. According to Linda, my mother seemed upset and confused about several upcoming matters she believed had already been arranged. Linda's final sentence caught my attention immediately. She kept saying she thought you were still handling those things. I read that line 3 times. Then I slowly lowered the phone. For the first time, I saw a possibility I had not considered before. Maybe my mother did not fully understand what had been taken from her. Maybe she had been encouraged to push me away without realizing everything that would disappear along with me. And if that was true, the consequences were only beginning. Over the next several days, I kept my promise to myself. I did not call my mother. I did not drive across town to solve problems. I did not step back into a role I had been explicitly told to leave. For years, I had been the person everyone relied on when something needed attention. Now I was gone, and for the first time, the system had to function without me. At first, there was silence. Then small cracks began to appear. On Monday afternoon, Linda called to tell me my mother had missed an appointment because nobody confirmed the transportation details. On Tuesday, Sarah mentioned that Evelyn seemed upset because a prescription refill had been delayed. On Wednesday, a repair technician arrived at my mother's house only to discover nobody had completed the paperwork required for the service request. None of these problems were disasters. They were simply the kinds of issues I used to handle before anyone noticed they existed. What struck me was how quickly they began piling up. For years, people assumed everything worked because everything was simple. The truth was very different. Everything worked because someone was quietly making it work. By Thursday evening, Sarah sounded genuinely concerned. She explained that her grandmother seemed increasingly confused about why so many things were suddenly going wrong. According to Sarah, Evelyn repeatedly asked the same question. Why is nobody helping me? Hearing that broke my heart. Not because I felt guilty. Because I knew my mother genuinely believed she had been abandoned. She still did not understand the full story. She still did not know what information had been withheld from her. The next morning, I received another unexpected call. This time it came directly from one of my mother's doctor's offices. The receptionist sounded embarrassed. She explained that several administrative issues had developed because previous contacts had been removed from the system and replacement information was incomplete. She was not calling to ask for help. She simply wanted clarification about historical records. Even that brief conversation revealed something important. People who worked with my mother for years still assumed I was involved because I had always been involved. The absence felt noticeable to everyone except the person who had engineered it. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited me. We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while she shared more observations. According to her, Brian seemed increasingly stressed. He spent much of his time solving problems he never realized existed. Scheduling conflicts, medical paperwork, account questions, service appointments. The invisible responsibilities were becoming visible. Sarah shook her head and said something I will never forget. I do not think he understood how much you actually did. Neither did most people. Caregiving often disappears behind its own success. When things run smoothly, nobody asks why. They simply assume smooth operation is normal. That evening, after Sarah left, I sat quietly in my living room thinking about the last 10 years. I did not regret helping my mother. Not for a second. What saddened me was realizing how easily effort can be rewritten when someone controls the narrative. 1,000 acts of kindness can be erased by a few carefully repeated lies. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed. The message came from an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I opened it. The text was short. Patricia, this is your mother's attorney. I believe there are several matters you should be aware of regarding recent decisions made on her behalf. I read the message twice, then a third time. Until that moment, I thought the situation revolved around family relationships, misunderstandings, manipulation. Emotional distance. Suddenly I realized there might be another layer entirely. One involving decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions my mother may not fully understand. As darkness settled outside my windows, I stared at the attorney's message and felt a familiar certainty growing inside me. The truth was bigger than I imagined. And it was finally starting to come into view. The following morning, I called the attorney. His name was Robert Ellis, and he had worked with my mother's legal affairs for several years. The moment he answered, I could tell he had been expecting my call. His voice was professional but cautious. He explained that he could not discuss every detail immediately, but he believed I should be aware of certain recent developments because my name had appeared repeatedly in previous records. That statement alone made my pulse quicken. For years, I had been deeply involved in helping my mother manage important matters. Suddenly, I was learning that decisions were being made without my knowledge. Robert carefully explained that several authorizations and communication preferences had recently been modified. Certain contacts had been removed. Certain responsibilities had been reassigned. None of those actions were illegal. None were necessarily improper. Yet one detail stood out. According to Robert, many of the changes happened within a surprisingly short period of time. As he spoke, I found myself staring out the window of my home office. The pattern felt familiar. Information redirected. Access reduced. Communication limited. It mirrored everything else I had been discovering. When the conversation ended, Robert said something that stayed with me. "Patricia, I am not suggesting anyone acted with bad intentions. I am simply saying that your mother may not fully understand the practical consequences of the decisions being made around her." After the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. That sentence echoed in my mind. Practical consequences. During the previous week, I had watched those consequences appear one by one. Missed appointments. Delayed prescriptions. Confusion about services. Small problems multiplying into larger ones. Around lunchtime, Sarah called with another update. This time her voice sounded almost relieved. She explained that Evelyn had started asking more questions. Questions Brian seemed uncomfortable answering. Apparently, my mother recently asked why certain offices no longer contacted me. She asked why transportation arrangements had become unreliable. She asked why simple tasks suddenly felt complicated. Most importantly, she asked why Patricia seemed to disappear overnight. Hearing that gave me an unfamiliar feeling. Hope. Not because I expected an immediate resolution. Because curiosity meant my mother was beginning to examine the story she had been given. Later that afternoon, Linda stopped by Evelyn's house and called me afterward. According to Linda, my mother appeared frustrated. Not angry. Frustrated. She kept insisting that things were easier before. She kept comparing current problems to the way things used to work. Linda shared one specific comment that caught my attention. "I do not understand why Patricia stopped helping." Those words broke my heart because they revealed how little my mother truly understood. From her perspective, I simply walked away. She did not know about the text message's impact. She did not know what information had been withheld. She did not know how many decisions had quietly pushed me out of her life long before that message arrived. That evening, I opened a storage box filled with old family photographs. Images from birthdays, holidays, summer vacations, ordinary moments spanning decades. In nearly every photograph, my mother and I stood beside each other. Looking through those memories reminded me why the situation hurt so deeply. This was never about winning an argument. It was never about proving someone wrong. It was about losing a relationship that mattered. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time the message came directly from Brian. It was the first communication I had received from him since everything began. The text was brief. "Mom wants to talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Just 4 words. Yet those 4 words represented something important. For the first time since that terrible message arrived, the silence between my mother and me had cracked. I did not know what she wanted to say. I did not know what she believed. I did not know whether she understood the truth. But I knew one thing with certainty. The story that had separated us was finally beginning to fall apart. For nearly an hour, I stared at Brian's message without responding. Not because I did not want to speak with my mother, because I was afraid of what I might hear. Over the previous week, I had learned enough to know that the situation was far more complicated than I originally believed. Yet I still did not know how much my mother understood. I still did not know whether she viewed me as a daughter or as the version of me someone else had described. Eventually, I typed a simple reply. When? The answer arrived almost immediately. Tomorrow morning. That night felt longer than any night in recent memory. I slept only a few hours. By morning, my emotions had settled into something quieter. I was not angry. I was not eager for confrontation. I simply wanted the truth. At 10 o'clock, I drove to my mother's house. The familiar street looked exactly as it always had. The same trees. The same mailbox. The same front porch where countless family photographs had been taken over the years. Yet everything felt different. When I knocked on the door, it was not Brian who answered. It was my mother. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. There was confusion in her eyes. And something else. Uncertainty. She stepped aside and quietly invited me inside. The living room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Brian sat in a chair near the window. Sarah was there as well. Nobody appeared comfortable. That alone told me this conversation mattered. My mother spoke first. Her voice was softer than I expected. Patricia, I need to ask you something. I nodded. She looked directly at me. Did you really stop caring about me last year? The question hit harder than I anticipated. Not because it was insulting. Because it revealed exactly how much misinformation she had absorbed. I slowly shook my head. Then I reached into my bag and placed several documents on the coffee table. Appointment records. Emails. Insurance confirmations. Transportation schedules. Years of support documented in black and white. I did not make a speech. I did not defend myself emotionally. I simply showed facts. One by one, my mother picked up the papers and examined them. As she read, the room grew quieter. Several times she looked confused. Several times she reread the same page. Eventually she looked toward Brian. Why did nobody tell me about these? She asked. Brian immediately began explaining. He talked about stress. He talked about simplifying communication. He talked about trying to help. Some of what he said may even have been partially true. But for the first time, nobody interrupted to protect the story. Nobody rushed to accept the explanation. Sarah quietly described what she had witnessed over the previous year. Linda's observations were mentioned. The changes to contact information were discussed. The redirected communications were discussed. Piece by piece, the narrative that separated my mother and me began unraveling in front of everyone. The most painful moment came when my mother looked down at the text message she had sent. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she whispered something that nobody expected. I do not remember writing it exactly like that. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My mother explained that she remembered being upset. She remembered discussing concerns. But she did not remember choosing those exact words. Hearing that felt like the final missing piece sliding into place. The issue had never been a single text message. The issue had been months of influence leading to that moment. Months of conversations. Months of assumptions. Months of controlled information. By the time the discussion ended, nobody was arguing anymore. The truth had become too visible. As I prepared to leave, my mother reached for my hand. Her eyes filled with tears. I think I have been told a story that was not completely true. For the first time since this began, I believed she finally understood that the distance between us had not appeared on its own. Someone had helped create it. And now that story was finally broken. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Real life rarely offers perfect endings. There were difficult conversations. Awkward silences. Moments when old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly. But there was also something that had been missing for a very long time. Honesty. Once the truth entered the room, people could no longer pretend they did not see it. My mother and I began speaking again, slowly at first. Neither of us tried to erase what happened. We talked about it openly. She admitted that over time she had come to rely on information that was filtered through other people. She admitted there were moments when she accepted assumptions without questioning them. Most importantly, she admitted that she never fully understood how much of her daily life I had been managing behind the scenes. Hearing those words did not magically erase the hurt, but they mattered. They mattered because they were real. Brian also changed, although not in the way I expected. For a while he remained defensive. Then reality began teaching lessons that arguments never could. The responsibilities he had gradually taken control of were far more complicated than they appeared. Coordinating care, managing appointments, solving administrative problems, maintaining communication. Those tasks required time, patience, and consistency. Eventually, even he acknowledged that many of the things he once dismissed were actually important. I did not celebrate that realization. There was nothing to celebrate. Families do not win when relationships break. They only lose less when people finally tell the truth. Sarah became an unexpected source of hope throughout the process. Her willingness to speak honestly helped expose problems that otherwise might have remained hidden. More importantly, she reminded me that integrity still existed within the family. Sometimes it only takes one person willing to say, "This is not right," to begin changing the direction of an entire story. Several months later, I sat beside my mother on her front porch as the sun settled low across the neighborhood. The evening air felt cool and peaceful. We watched children riding bicycles down the street while neighbors walked their dogs along the sidewalks. Ordinary moments. The kind people often overlook until they nearly disappear. My mother turned toward me and smiled softly. "I missed having you around," she said. Simple words. Yet they carried more weight than any apology. I smiled back. I never stopped being here. And that was the truth. Even when I stepped away, I never stopped caring. I simply stopped fighting to stay in a place where I had been told I was not wanted. Looking back now, the most important lesson had nothing to do with manipulation, family conflict, or misunderstandings. The lesson was about boundaries. For years, I believed love meant enduring anything, fixing everything, carrying responsibilities without question. I know differently now. Love without respect eventually becomes exhaustion. Care without honesty eventually becomes resentment. And loyalty without boundaries becomes permission for other people to rewrite your value. The text message that shattered my world ended up revealing something I desperately needed to learn. My worth was never dependent on someone else's version of the story. It existed whether they recognized it or not. As autumn turned into winter and life gradually settled into a healthier rhythm, my relationship with my mother continued rebuilding. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. And that honesty made all the difference. Sometimes people ask whether I regret replying with only 2 words that night. The answer is no. Those 2 words forced the truth into the open. They ended years of confusion and exposed problems that had been hiding in plain sight. By stepping back, I finally allowed everyone to see what had really been happening. And in the end, the greatest victory was not proving anyone wrong. It was reclaiming my peace, restoring my dignity, and remembering that the people who truly love you should never need to be convinced of your value.